Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Skybound Capital's podcast series, Under the Macroscope. And let's talk, as we usually do, about macro issues, those issues that affect everyone, really, in their everyday lives. Sometimes they're specific to investing on this podcast series, but today we're broadening the net. And we're welcoming to the podcast again Skybound Capital's Chief Information Security Officer. Sounds like a very grandiose title, but it's a vital role played in the group as information and the way it's stored is under constant threat. And at a recent strategy session conducted by the Skybound Capital Group with people coming in from offices around the world, one of the buzz acronyms, I can't even call it a buzzword, was Chat GPT, the influence of artificial intelligence on our everyday lives and indeed on the investment industry more specifically. And Chat GPT is ruffling feathers, it's creating waves and causing people to stop, to pause, to think about how artificial intelligence might or has already changed the way we think about the manner in which we work. So, William, great to have you on the podcast. First of all, a simple question for those who have not been exposed to all the talk out there. What is ChatGPT?
That's a very good question, Matt, and one that is difficult to answer without delving into the buzzwords, as you say. But I want to keep it simple today. The easiest way to explain what it is to experience it for yourself. But to give you an idea as to what this experience could be like, since its inception 6 months ago, over the first 5 days alone, it gained its first million users. They currently have over 100 million users only 6 months later. What is this revolution that is getting so much attention without any real marketing behind it? This has really grown organically very, very quickly. And it becomes very obvious why once you start interacting with this artificial intelligence system on your own. And you can absolutely do that. It's free to sign up. Just go to the OpenAI website and they will direct you to register. And you will be greeted with a prompt. Now, that prompt where you can now ask this, call it intelligence, a question, seems to be quite intimidating at first. And I find people almost try to use it as if it's Google. And they play around with a bit in that manner and they leave quite unimpressed. But if you dig a little bit deeper, it becomes obvious why this is such a phenomenon. So I would urge you to explore it yourself. And here's a few tips that I would recommend. Don't talk to it like it's Google. Speak to it like it's a human. I know that's already an unsettling proposition for a lot of people, but this artificial intelligence is built on language. It's a large language model, and it responds incredibly well to good prompts that's backed by that extensive training that it has undergone. Ask your questions with as much detail as possible. When you start adding unique context, you'll start getting the real unique answers that will make you sit back and realize, oh, this is something very different. And while you're exploring this, I would hedge and say that just be aware that there is a knowledge cutoff, meaning that the system is not connected to the internet in the sense that it has the up-to-date news of current affairs. It has historical time frame associated with which keeps moving as they update the system. But just be aware of that. Now, what sort of examples would you see? What can you do to really understand what this is about? Well, one of the features that I use it for, I would say at least on a weekly basis, is to simplify complex topics. You can say that, let's say that there was a breakthrough in fusion reactors. I have absolutely no idea what that is. Well, you can ask ChatGPT, please explain this following article to me as if I'm a 5-year-old. Let's set the bar that low. And it will do that with incredible efficacy. And you can then, of course, increase it, say 10-year-old, high school graduate. It really has a very good utility. There's great utility in explaining very, very complicated topics. Another example is, and this is a little bit more novel, no pun intended, but I think it gives, it really sort of demonstrates what sets it apart, is it can explain literature from a character's perspective. So one that I used yesterday is, I said, pretend to be Jay Gatsby and explain from his perspective why he keeps staring at the green light. And in character, he replied, already associating human characteristics to it, but it replied from that person's perspective. And it was just, it was so amazing to be able to digest information in a different way. You can also debate with Chat GPT. You can give it a proposition and say, I would like to practice my debate skills. And it will give you a rebuttal. And you can go back and forth, and you can really use it to sharpen your arguments. And I think the last sort of example that I would urge you to try is, it is quite good at summarizing a large body of text, which, you know, in today's day and age, when we're inundated with so many white papers and articles and journals that we need to go through, it can be useful to get just a bullet point summary of what the content is about. Now, that all said, as much as I am very enthusiastic about this technology, I have to caution you on sending it confidential and proprietary information. They do store the data that you submit to them because they use that data to train the model further. And that is in violation of many privacy acts around the world, including GDPR. So if you do want to use this for a professional, and in a professional setting, just be mindful that there's currently a limitation on using the free service that's available to everybody. Now, that said, there is the free service, and then there's the next level, which is only available through subscription, and that is Chat GPT 4. It is a very different animal. So to give you an idea, first, when you speak to it, it on surface level doesn't seem all that different. But as you get into more complex topics, you see that it excels at tasks that require advanced reasoning, complex instructions. It has a greater level of understanding, and it is also more creative. In casual conversation, the distinction between the free version and the new version can be subtle, but it really comes out on its own when you give it much more significant and nuanced problems. Now, Matt, the security concerns, of course, because this is ultimately what my role is about, and this is the lens through which I have to view these types of technologies. So assuming that the audience will explore this on their own, they will come to the conclusion that this is the most revolutionary technology, certainly in the last decade. And we need to sit up and take notice, because this is going to change the way that we work. There's no doubt about that. So with this new opportunity, what's the hedge? What do we need to be careful about? Well, there's a lot. But there's three things that I'm going to put forward to this audience today. The first is misinformation. Once you understand the power of how ChatGPT can be used to generate just vast bodies of data that seem to be written by a human, you get the sense that this can be abused. And it has. Very recently, as you are aware, Matt, we discussed this. There was an interview published by a German tabloid magazine where they claimed to have done an interview with Michael Schumacher. Of course, that interview was fake. The reality is that these tools are designed to assist and augment human abilities. It brings out, I believe, the best of what we have to offer, as well as the worst of what we have to offer. These tools can be used for various purposes, both ethical and unethical, and really depends on the intent and the integrity of the user. It is important to acknowledge that the potential misuse isn't a reflection on the lack of utility or utility of the tool, but rather on the individuals that choose to use it in a detrimental manner. And of course, unfortunately, there will always be a small percentage of the population that would tilt towards misusing these otherwise fantastic tools. The second concern is how this can be used to generate incredibly convincing phishing emails. That is, I really take a deep breath when I mention that, because it throws out so many of the safeguards that we currently have in place. You know, the most effective safeguard is the person receiving the email. And Matt, you've attended the training that we deliver so frequently. And there's a focus on how can you identify, hover your mouse over a link, check the address. But the reality is that those instincts only kick in when there is a subtle giveaway that there might be something wrong. And I fear that the phishing emails will become so convincing that you wouldn't even be prompted to act cautiously and question whether this came from a trusted source. Thirdly, and this is the one that I think senior leadership and various companies need to be most mindful of, and that is that Chat GPT sometimes generates inaccurate information. It is a technology that's very much in its infancy, and I do believe it will improve. But the reality is that currently it can very convincingly generate information which is simply not true. It will cite a journal article that doesn't exist, and it will happily do it because at the end of the day, this is a language model. It is not built to have any real insight into what it is saying. It is simply mimicking, parroting human speech in such a sophisticated way that it's easy to forget that fact.
But William, I'd just like to ask you at this juncture. So what you've articulated here is something that can be extremely useful. You've very clearly given us some examples of where that might be true. For example, taking a vast mine of data and summarizing it in a far quicker way than somebody might ordinarily be able to do. So you can see this as a provider of efficiency
absolutely
within a business context, but surely you also understand the fear associated, not only with its potential to provide you with incorrect information. So I guess the lesson there is, you need to continue to double check that work, even though it's created efficiency in your life in the first instance. But you can understand the fear of people feeling that they are now replaceable by something that is supposedly artificial.
Absolutely. I do have sympathy with that. It shouldn't come as a surprise to people that I'm in an industry that is constantly disrupting itself. And it is almost certainly the case that my job and responsibility will be very different in 10 years' time because the landscape has moved as much. So I'm very sensitive, and I would almost say somewhat accustomed to a world in which change is the constant. But you have other industries such as, let's say, accounting, which has been around for hundreds of years, which hasn't had a real disruption, certainly not to the extent that ChatGPT could potentially provide. Well, to those people, I would say that two things. The calculator didn't replace the mathematician. It only made mathematicians more productive. The reality is that insight, I believe, it's a human quality, at least at this stage of the artificial intelligence game. And secondly, and this I think will always be the case, is a machine cannot be held accountable. Only a human can. because of course there needs to be a repercussion. So I think that at the end of the day, this is going to be a tool that you can use to become much more productive, but you will still be responsible for the quality of that work, as well as the impact of that work. Just because you are doing more doesn't necessarily mean that you're doing better.
I'd like to introduce the word interpretation here, or interpret, because there's still, if I'm hearing you correctly, this onus on a person in their business to interpret the data. It may have been summarized in record time, but the interpretation of that data and how it is then put to use in the business context remains the responsibility of a person.
Absolutely. In fact, I would caution against summarizing a body of data and just relying on the summary. No, I think a more responsible use would be you have read the information, but you would like to summarize it in order to keep it in your notes. I think that is much more, that is the ethical approach to it.
So following on from that, do you see Chat GPT being able to potentially stifle creativity and encouraging laziness amongst certain people?
Yeah, I have thought of this through the perspective of various roles in the business. And I think that there are certain jobs. Imagine, for example, my job, where I have to do a lot of report writing, the compliance side, where you have to get through vast amounts of policies and procedures. There's a lot of menial, really boilerplate type work, which I would much rather have that automated to some extent so that I can spend my energy focusing on really productive projects which require the sort of creative thinking. I think Chat GPT, a good exercise would be, and it's a bit of a philosophical one, is ask it to write a joke for you, and you will find that it is lackluster at best. The reason why I mention that is it is not a machine that's meant to be creative. It's meant to be analytical. So I almost think that if we can outsource the menial tasks, fantastic. I'm all for it.
Well, note to self: do not lose your sense of humor.
No.
Because it's irreplaceable. William, this is going to be a space that is going to, by its very definition, continually evolve. It's going to be a dynamic space. You spoke to the number of users from day 0 to month 6, and the incredible pace with which this technology is being adopted and being used and being experimented with. But for now, what does the long-term future of AI look to you?
So long-term, this is where I'm much more cautious, is artificial intelligence has been the field of broken promises and the thing of sci-fi for the past 50 years. And as soon as we hear of Siri, then we find out actually it's not quite what marketing revealed. So I can point to what Microsoft promises their integration of this technology will look like. And while that is impressive, I will say that we don't even need to look that far. We can simply look at what we already have as an indication of just how powerful this is.
Well, William, it's fascinating. And it's always good to get your view, because you spend most of your working day looking at technologies that are looking to disrupt. And as you say, it's a constantly changing world. It's a constantly changing environment in which we operate. And at the very least, we need to be aware and mindful of the impact that technologies such as Chat GPT can have on the daily operation of our lives and indeed our businesses. So I feel certain that in less than 3 or 4 months, we'll be back on this podcast and talking about the latest updates and the latest influences that it has had. But for now, thank you William, for coming on to the podcast. Remember, if you want to access the podcast series Under the Macroscope, you can do so on Apple, Spotify, or the Google Play Store for Android, also on Skybound Capital's YouTube channel, or indeed on the website, the Media and Insights section of Skybound Capital's website at www.skyboundcapital.com. And hopefully I'll be here still next time to deliver another episode of Under the Macroscope, if I have not been replaced by something artificial. Hope to see you then.